So how should we do this? I mean, I can start and kind of give a bit of a run through of the slides, but this is probably, there's enough intel in this room for us, between us, to all come up with something sensible and meaningful for us to walk away with. So really the goal here is just to start and then help to facilitate a conversation that we can get gems out of, ideally. And it might be able to help to kind of, I don't know, identify ways that we can navigate this economic uncertainty that we're all facing.
Might be useful just to know, since we're a small group, who's in the room and what you were hoping to get out of the session.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'll start. Yeah, so I'm Gavin from Scottish Rural College.
Just hold on a second. Can I just have one of those microphones?
You can have that one.
Just so the guys online can hear what we're all saying.
Right.
Yep, Gavin from Scottish Rural College. Just totally new to organic growing and everything like that, but I'm quite interested to find out more and just to be in the room for that, but total novice. So yeah.
My name is Gareth Roberts from Regather in Sheffield, fruit and veg box scheme, and I'm just always interested to hear from CSA Network and OOOOBY and other people here in the room. So that's what I wanted out of it. That's okay.
I'm David from Langton's farm, and just looking at how we can increase the sales on our farm and resilience. So this looked great.
So I'm Julia Wright at Centre for Agroecology, Water and Resilience Research Centre at Coventry University. And I'm here actually on behalf of my PhD students because some of them are doing research around this topic. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Christopher Stopes, and I'm at the moment doing a small project for the Gaia Seed Sovereignty Programme on organic and open pollinated seeds and looking at the commercial availability as opposed to seed saving. And I'm here because I've been in touch with the CSA and talked with Gareth just the other day, and the other person, I can't remember her name, the secretary. Huh? Suzy. You, it is you. Yeah, it is you, indeed. I thought it was. About the way in which the CSA network can be involved in seed saving, and because that in a sense is part of the model for increasing the resilience, is improving the opportunity for seed saving. What's the scope for that? Thank you.
I'm Lizzie. I've just started at the OGA and helping with the online stuff. But I'm actually quite glad that I got put into this group because it's kind of exactly what we've been looking at. I work in a market garden in Somerset, and it grows on about ½ an acre. And yeah, it's really we've kind of just been looking at how to become more resilient and kind of cut out the middleman. So yeah, I've also got some people coming in, but maybe I'll wait till everyone's gone just to filter through a few more.
Hi, I'm Tony Little. I'm an OGA director, but actually I'm changing hats for this session. I also work for the Land Workers Alliance on a project really to help farmers and growers understand local direct marketing systems and also short supply chains, but also to help with some of the sort of infrastructure and strategic development that will actually enable direct sales and short supply chain systems to really feed a very significant portion of the UK. So that's why I'm here.
I'm Pete Dollymore, and I co-ran a box scheme in Brighton area for about 20 years, and have sort of chucked it in largely to work in education with teenagers. And so now we've got to the point where we've actually got a pretty good garden that we're all growing on, and now the kids are kind of like trying to sell the produce out the front to their parents, and it's a lot more difficult than they thought, and that I thought. I kind of took the bot scheme model for granted. Yeah, that works, but you know, there's other ways, and I'm just interested in that kind of difference between the scale. You know, the large scale, medium scale bot scheme, we were doing like 600-700 boxes a week, down to perhaps 20 boxes a week, and like how that relationship with your customers changes, and the different ways of doing it, really.
Do you want to introduce how many people are there online?
5. So we've got Matt Sutton looking to start a small organic market garden near Salisbury next year and looking to establish and develop local community market, direct sales CSA model. Sally, Rob and Ed from Gunan Growers, a small CSA in Cornwall, interested in methods to improve the admin for their direct sales and get some inspiration. Charlotte from community-led Camel CSA in Cornwall. And I've got a question, but maybe we can come to them afterwards.
Sorry.
We were going to start by saying we're not related as far as we know.
Yeah. True, we're not, but well, maybe we are. Who knows?
And I guess, yeah, we're potentially quite different scales. I'm aware that CSA in general is a lot smaller than probably a lot of people at this conference. And one of the things we were just chatting about before coming in was kind of, so a lot of what I'm talking about is the sort of social capital resilience that CSAs bring. And maybe one of the questions after is how that can kind of support or be translated into larger growing businesses. But yeah, that's the...
Yeah, and so just as a distinction, the CSA model is largely where a customer will buy a season upfront and subscribe to that farm, and then know that once a week or once every regular occurrence, it's going to be a box delivered to them based on what was available, and they're effectively investing in the farm. And whereas a box scheme is kind of one level of abstraction, removed from that, it's I'm going to give you my money on a regular basis in return for food on a regular basis, but I have the ability to start and stop. And so there's a bit more freedom, not so much commitment, but typically the audience for a box scheme is larger than the audience for a CSA.
Yeah, I mean, our charter, apart from being agroecological and being viable business, which is kind of in there to distinguish from a more sort of social farms and gardens model, says that there's kind of, direct community relationship, which means that feedback from our CSAs is that above, I think Stroud's about the biggest, above like 150 households, you stop having, you start to lose that relationship. So they sort of are small by nature. Yeah. And that they are direct sales model where the majority of the produce comes from on farm. So they're not just horticultural, there are meat, dairy, fuel, fibre, flour CSAs, but the vast majority in the UK are horticultural. It's different. I mean, across the world, there's CSAs in a lot of countries. Ours is probably less solidarity based than some of the charters in other countries. There's much more emphasis on everybody so we call them members, not customers, but every member has to input into growing on the farm or doing some of the farm work. And the sort of, in the UK, the sharing of the risks and responsibilities, a lot of CSAs, if a crop failed, would probably buy in to support that crop failure so that their members got tomatoes if they didn't. Whereas in other countries, they'd be more likely to say there aren't any tomatoes, but you might get loads of courgettes next week. So it's, Yeah. So that's, I guess, the distinction is if you think of the concentric circles, you've got the deep sort of green in the middle, and then the lighter green, and out it goes. That is probably a decent way of sort of recognising the differences. Agroecology.
Yeah. So there's a much tends to be a much deeper investment at the CSA level, but I don't think that they are mutually exclusive. As a farm that's a market garden that's producing food, depending on your capacity to produce, it may be a layering. It may be, right, we have a CSA where this is the arrangement with our CSA members, and then we also have a box scheme where this is the arrangement with those customers, and then we also have something beyond that. It could be whatever, but think that sort of sets a context of where the crossover is and how we sort of view the short supply chain in the direct to customer market.
And a bit of a recognition that not every grower wants to.
Right.
You have to be good at talking to people to make a CSA work, and not every grower or farmer wants that, or is good at it, and that's fine. And not every person wants to have a direct relationship with their grower or farmer, which is also fine. So there's room for everybody. It's
yeah, exactly. So I don't have a clicker or anything. Is that something that comes with the thing, or are you going to be able to?
It's all on the.
It's all here. Just the mouse?
Yeah, it's the only thing we've got.
Okay, that's cool.
Would you like to click for you?
You want to click?
That I'll click for you.
Thanks. Right, so yeah, really do feel free to jump in and ask questions as we go. We've got time and not many people, so we've got time to kind of relax around it. Please click. Thank you. Okay, so this is my attempt at trying to articulate or illustrate the general problem that we have with food in general. And that is that at one end, a grower, a food producer could be, a baker, or it could be a farm, someone growing a market garden, or it could be chicken farm or whatever it is. At one end, they want to earn a decent living. And on the other end is customers that want good food at a fair price. But the scenario is that typically up to 80% of the value of food is supply chain cost. It varies a lot. But if you look at a long haul convoluted supply chain, it can even be more than that, meaning that the grower would be getting paid as little as 20p in the retail pound.
Yeah, I think the average in 2019, DEFRA average was 41% of sales price went to the farmer, which is.
Right. So that would be 59% as an average. And so it depends in each scenario. But the point being is it's a long, wasteful, expensive supply chain that gets in the way of both those people having the kind of experience that they want. And so next slide, please, Tony. Thank you. A solution is effectively a direct model, direct to customer, where in this case, we're talking about approximately only 40% of the prices in supply chain. But the difference is that with this model, the farmer or the grower or the producer owns and controls that supply chain. So even though there is a cost in, collating, packing, the packaging, loading in the van, doing the deliveries, and all the logistics around that, it's a cost that the producer can carry themselves, and a service that the producer can do on their own without having to outsource that. So in effect, the full retail value is coming back to the producer. They've just had to add on layers of services to their food in order to make sure it meets the market. And so therefore, the key to this working, in my opinion, is how do you simplify that process from the point where it's harvested to the point where it gets to the customer's doorstep? How do you simplify that and make that as efficient as possible so that a food producer can handle that work, right? And not get overwhelmed and not have to, find out that it's actually cost them a lot more than they've been charging and so on. And by doing that, getting that simplified, then that producer can also not only produce their own food, which is being sold, but then they now have a service that they can offer to other surrounding producers that may not want to take on that supply chain element. And they can say, well, look, I've got a customer base, I'm delivering direct to, I've got all the systems and so forth in order to facilitate that. I can start buying in. I can start buying in my bread and my eggs and my milk and, chutneys and so forth. And so that farm starts to become a hub, like a farm-based food hub. And what we've learned and observed now that there's around 40 or so hubs running on OOOBY at the moment is that it's the farm-based hubs that tend to have the more resilient, you know, business models, because their overheads are more of, well, it's a barn on my farm, I'm not having to pay rent. My team, I'm not having to get a dedicated team of people to do this work. It's just our farm crowd, you know, so our farm team who are being spread across more jobs, and so we're able to kind of make sure we're giving them more hours and filling out their income, you know. So that's been an interesting insight that we've observed, is that, yeah, as a farm, you actually have got a competitive advantage, I think, in doing it that way.
Sorry, it says on that slide better prices.
Sorry, hold on.
Yeah, sorry.
Just pass that mic, thanks, right?
On that last slide, it said better prices.
So, yeah.
Is that, you mean lower prices for the consumer?
Yeah, I think
Are they?
ultimately what it means is that it can mean better low prices for the consumer, or it can mean the prices, the quality of the food that you're getting for what you pay is better. You know, typically the things to consider around that is how well the food is grown. You know, if it's organic and so on, that's great. But the speed from the gate to the plate has a huge impact on the experience of that food and the quality of the food.
It depends on what you're comparing it to, obviously.
Yeah.
Comparing like for like. For sure, when we were running the box scheme, it was probably 75% of the cost per item compared to exactly the same product in a local store. It wouldn't really be in supermarkets, it wouldn't sell that sort of thing. But if you were going to a shop or another online retailer where there was a longer supply chain, so that's how we survived, really, was by we had a lot of goodwill from our customers. A lot of goodwill from our customers, but also we were always able to keep the price favourable. And another thing is business rates on farms. You know, you're paying less tax, which when you start to expand the business a bit, really makes a bit of difference.
Right.
So you pay business rates per square metre of, like if you're renting a unit on an industrial estate, it's going to be a lot more expensive than a barn on your farm.
Yeah, yeah. So, Suzy, did you want to?
Yeah, so I'm going to sort of talk a bit about CSA, and it's been interesting kind of thinking about this talk, and combined with, I guess, a growing awareness on the CSA network's part that we don't understand much about economic, environmental, or social sort of resilience within the network, and it's something we want to understand better. So we've just got figures from 7 CSAs, and we're doing some work trying to sort of provide some benchmarks. It's really complicated because CSAs are so diverse, but we're hoping to have at least an idea of benchmark figures and sort of the length of time it takes CSAs to get to a break-even point. On environmental resilience, we're also working with somebody at CORE, Barbara Smith, looking at biodiversity on small farms to understand that better. And then I'm going to talk mostly, I guess, about social, kind of community and social resilience. So Joe Hunt, who's an economist turned farmer who runs Not Feral Produce in Scotland, which is one of the OOOBY's hubs, is doing the work on economics with us. And we were sort of chatting to him the other day, and he's saying it's a different sort of business. And I guess I want to preface really the whole of the bit about CSA in saying that it's really tricky to understand CSA in standard economic terms. Return on investment and gross margin, I don't even remember the term. Yeah. It's just really bad ways to look at what a CSA produces. And he said, I don't say I make an £8,000 profit. I say I feed 220 families and I create 4 real jobs. And I mean, we're also increasingly seeing CSAs, instead of kind of just growing, which is the standard economic model, at the moment, we're seeing CSAs get to that kind of 100, 150 mark and then support another CSA as a separate business to start. So this kind of proliferation, mushroom form of business growth rather than just getting bigger and bigger. And if you get bigger and bigger, you lose, as I was kind of saying before, you lose the social capital. So yeah, CSOs have economic, environmental and social capital, and they also have cultural, human and political capital. And there's an article, it was actually a study of CSAs in Iowa in the States done in 2012, but the authors of the study found that it was the CSAs who tried to address multiple capitals that were the most successful and sustainable long term, which was really interesting. So the ones that were just looking at economic capital tended to be the ones that failed first, or didn't make it. Yeah, I guess, I mean, CSA has seen a massive expansion during the pandemic, with supermarkets not being able to meet demand, and our sort of vision is for a CSA in every neighbourhood. That means some definite changes for us. CSAs, as I'm sure you're all aware, very white and middle class, tends to be pretty rural. So if we're going to be in every neighbourhood, we need to work out how to make CSA work in urban centres, which I think some of the stuff that OOOBY's looking at could be really helpful in bringing CSAs together and providing a virtual link between people and land that is impossible in a city because there's just not the land to grow on to support city residents. Yeah, I think we've also been doing some work on how CSAs can kind of support people through the cost of living crisis, and interestingly, a real variety of views. Some CSAs say, I'm already overwhelmed with growing, that's enough. And other CSAs say, we're community supported and it's mutual. So we support the community support us. So we don't have a kind of, because we don't have a, it's right or wrong. And the CSAs involved in that piece of work kind of agreed that they would come together through the differences with that. Essentially, all of them wanted to help, but their kind of perceived ability to help or support was different. And then that was fine. Yeah, I guess the social resilience, where it came through a bit in the pandemic with the sort of support for CSAs, but so Joe was also saying he lost 4 polytunnels in the storms earlier this year, and he put out a call for crowdfunding to put up a new structure, and within 4 weeks he'd raised, I can't remember how much it was, but enough money to put up his new structure in soft loans from 30 members. Actually, I think it's less than 4 weeks. It was Canalside that in 4 weeks raised 105,000 to buy their land. So Canalside at near Leamington Spa, and then Plotgate in Somerset raised 25,000 in community shares. So there's real sort of sense of when it's tough, the community will support you back. So you build that community resilience, and then it builds and supports you back. And there's another bit of research which has just been released by Angelina Sandring and Bellamy, I think she's called, from UWE in Bristol, saying the social capital is built by CSAs and helps foster and stabilise the grassroots of innovation that is needed for the development of a sustainable food system. So actually, again, not seeing CSA as the answer to everything, but CSAs feel like a vital bit of building a sustainable food system. Sorry for all the pauses, I'm just trying to work out what to say next. Yeah, I mean, I think there is somebody out there, Bert Bomford from Cardiff, quoting him, saying, by co-financing the production and distribution of food supply and fitting food supply to consumer demand, CSA aims to remove the dynamics of competition and profit from the food system, which again is kind of one way of looking at how we can make it more sustainable. We did a survey of our members and so our member farms and then some of their members earlier this year. And we found out from the members that, so 82% of members, so these are customers, as you will, from CSAs, said that being a member of a CSA had improved their overall quality of life. 79% said it had improved their cooking and eating skills. 55% it improved their physical health and 63% mental health. 54% said it had increased their skills and 63% said it increased their social networks. And that's apart from the fact that they were getting food from it. So it's quite an impressive kind of holistic look at how you can support a community to grow in loads of different ways. we also asked our CSAs about how they were feeling in resilience terms. And economically, they scored overall a 2.9 out of 5. And we're aware that probably economic resilience is the bit which feels hardest to make work, hence trying to do this work. And then 3.5 and 3.5 on environmental and social resilience. And we also asked them about their own well-being, and their well-being scores using the Warwick Edinburgh survey were either the same as or higher than the general population. It was the ONS, actually we used the ONS questions, but were the same or higher than the ONS. They were particularly high on feeling that what you did was worthwhile. Compared to the Royal Agricultural Benevolent Institution's 21 survey on mental health of farmers, there was, I mean, it was that 36% of farmers were probably or possibly depressed, and a third were experiencing medium or high anxiety. So our farms scored 2.7 out of 10 on the anxiety scale, which is a lot lower as an average. Yeah, so I guess it's just kind of how can we kind of, yeah, what can we, I suppose I'm interested in kind of what can we take from larger schemes in terms of supporting the economic side of CSA, because CSA farmers and growers still need to earn enough to live on, even though I suppose the other thing I wanted to say was CSAs feel like they fit somewhere in between a standard business and a charity, and even with the sort of invention of KICs, community interest companies, they don't feel like they've really filled the gap for a proper social enterprise. So kind of what governance model do social businesses take, and I mean, yeah, Joe was sort of saying they will operate generally on a more charitable basis, which is they look to make kind of an 8% profit, which is then reinvested rather than making profit, which is taken out. So I think there's another bit of work there for us to look at a sort of better financial model for CSAs to use. But I think we can learn from you on that. And then maybe there's some stuff around the sort of social support that CSAs receive from members and that sense of belonging that, you know, hopefully can be used on larger farms.
Yeah.
I think that's me talked out.
Great, thanks. So this is a pie chart which is definitely wrong in the sense that there's no right as to exactly how it plays out. But as a general guide, kind of think about what are the unit economics for a direct to supply chain type of business, and each one of these, if you look at 50%, the model that we always worked with was the farmer has to, for the actual food in bulk to sort of land, needs to get at least 50% of the retail value. That's the goal. And then the remaining 50% is basically getting the product from the gate to the plate and any profit that gets out of that. So you're looking at, I've seen, I don't know how many profit and loss statements now for box schemes, and it is surprising. It largely follows this pattern that you're looking at around 10% is for your packing and packaging. So your boxes and your actual labour of collating and packing into the boxes, ready to be loaded into the van. And then around 10% is transport, assuming a certain, you know, standard sort of density of housing and whatever your run is like. I can say for sure for Knockfarrell, their transport is way higher than that because they cover the whole of the islands from coast to coast. It's amazing how far they go. It's incredible. But, you know, as a general rule, 10% for that. Your overheads will, again, vary a lot, but, you know, based on, let's call it, for the sake of easy calculations, based on, say, a 250 customer box scheme, you could be looking at around about 6% of your overheads. But again, that depends on whether you're on a high street or whether you're an industrial estate or whether you're up north or whether you're down south or whatever it is in terms of your overheads. But it's not uncommon it'd be somewhere around 6%. And then you've got marketing, and marketing is often the one that actually gets squeezed out of the equation, because it's the sort of thing where I know we should be doing it, but we don't really know how to do it. We're not really sure that it's going to actually work, and so we'll do that next month, and I'm sure we will. But if you are running a fairly sustainable model, then you want to be investing something into just keeping the word out there, and allowing for any attrition and things like that. But so looking at around the 5% mark. Then admin, and admin can be, anything from printing out the paperwork and the labels and things like that, to handling the customers, to managing the payments, to, coordinating the, getting the run sheets all organized and so forth. And so it's both labor as well as tools costs for that, which can add up to around the 5% mark. Software, that's a combination of software. So I would throw, for us, that would include the OOOBY software, but it's also other software that you might be using. Might be using Xero, or you might be using some places like to use a sort of sophisticated route optimization software, things like that. So you could be looking anywhere sort of up to 4% for the software, and then hopefully that leaves behind around 10% of profit, which is rare. Actually, it's not common. It'll actually come out to that, because month to month those slices of the pie change all over the place. They're not static at all. That's kind of like a snapshot of a potential.
Can I just ask salary costs for the different things included in the different bits?
Yeah.
Are they in the food bit?
Well, the salary costs the salary costs are included. So the food production bit, with the food bit, that's usually assuming that there is actually a profit margin in the food production itself. Right. So you're almost splitting out. Sorry, thanks for that. You're kind of looking at splitting out. It's almost two businesses, right? So there is the food, they're producing the food and getting it to the hub, or getting it to the barn where the packing is happening, is one business, and all the labor and input costs and so forth there. And it can generate, if it's running at 50% of retail, it can be generating a profit in its own right. And then the supply chain side. So yeah, I'm breaking down the supply chain side for that. But what invariably happens is you've got all these constantly emerging anomalies of costs that never go away. Well, this month that we had to, fix the van. Next month we had a problem with the cool room, and the next month there was such and such got injured and we had to train up a new person, and the next month, so there's always something that's chewing into that what would be a profit margin. But that hopefully just kind of gives you a bit of a sense of, in aggregate, what I sort of looked across seems to be sort of around about what's possible. I guess the key to these unit economics are that when you're running a direct to market model, it's important to have a sense of where are the benchmarks, because you can easily end up spending 17% on transport and not know that 17% is too much. Right? You could be going like that for months, and never really look at your P&L and break it down and say, how much are we spending on transport relative to our total revenue? And it's like, whoa, that's too much. And we've spent more. We've spent 17% on transport in the past, and when that's happened, we're like, okay, what's happened? How come that's going on? And you start to identify problems that are occurring. It could just be a really slow, lazy driver that's just notices you're too distracted on this and that and gets away with just taking their time, right? Or it could be all manner of things. And the same thing with your packing. It's, if you've got a sense of where the benchmarks are, at the end of each month, you can go through your numbers and you can look and you can say, oh, wow, we only spent 8% on packing this month. That's great. What do we do right? Or we're spending too much on packing. We're spending 13% on packing. What could we be doing more efficiently? And then there's a question of, you know, how you configure your packing stations. Like one of the things that that really blew my mind recently was we always had a packing arrangement where you had your packing stations. So we were doing around 500 boxes, you know, anywhere between 500 and 700 boxes a week back in Auckland. And the way we had it was we had a box person at the beginning of the line who would erect the boxes, you know, and put their label on and then pass it along like a table or conveyor. And then you'd have your person at station number 1 who would do your big heavy stuff and put that into the box and then move it across to the next person. And they put the next stuff in and move it along. And then it would get to the end of the packing line and the people putting this leafy greens on top with any of the kind of more delicate other add-ons, seal the box, stick it on a pallet, right? There's that versus you have everyone, I've got a box, I'm going to start at one end, I'm going to put the heavy stuff in, I'm going to walk all the way around to the leafy greens, and that's my box that I then put on the pallet. And so it's more like that type of arrangement. But then I found, and you know, they work out fairly similar. But then I was talking to Daniel from Trinity Farm in Nottingham, and he's by far got the most efficient packing. And I was amazed. You got one packer. One packer does nearly 300 boxes a week. And he stands in one station and he'll, right, we're doing this type of box. So he'll go and bring all the food for that type of box, put it around himself. He's got shelves stuck behind him, shelves to the left and right of him. And he just goes for it and just knocks out whole boxes by himself. And it turns out that for him, it's great. He puts his headphones on, don't have to talk to anyone. And he just goes and he's like a machine. And he's, you know, their box packing is like way lower than anyone else, which I had not imagined that would work. The biggest problem with that is that he knows everything. And if he's the weak link in the chain, so if he's having a bad day, then Daniel has to step in and Daniel's not as good as him and so on. So these are all sort of considerations, but you could do something like that you could break that down and say, oh, well, we're going to have this packet do all of these boxes and this packet do all of those boxes. So there are you know, there are different circumstances depending on your space that you've got available, depending on, you know, your existing team, depending on your preferences, whatever, as to how you configure things in order to make that part of what we call the supply chain more efficient. But I think the general rule is if you've got a bit of a feel for what average is across the industry and what lots of different people have contributed into this data pool of this sort of breakdown, you can get a feel for, at least you can get a sense that you're not going too far off what would be, you know, a reasonable cost for that. So yeah, I just suggest that you keep tabs on that. And then you'll find your own benchmarks as well. Like that's a really loose average. Once you've done it yourself and you've gone through each part, you review it once a month, hopefully, if you have a chance, and you look to tighten certain things up, then you'll start to find where is your own sweet spot depending on, you know, your circumstance. So you know, the overheads, for example, that's just an immovable 12%. If that's what it is, and then you've got to just work with whatever else you can flex. Yeah, so I think, I don't know if anyone got any questions on that one. If yeah, please go Gary.
So I was just to start, what happens to that profit? So where does it go?
Well, it depends on the arrangement. If it's a farm, then it's often can be the farmer's money, you know, income, if they haven't factored if they're not actually working in that supply chain themselves. So if they're the owner of that business and they're employing all the staff, and that becomes part of their household income. Or if it's a CIC, then that's something they can then reinvest in other parts of the business. So it all depends on the nature of that business.
Okay, great. And then, yeah, I mean, it's sort of following on Suzy's point about salary costs. I mean, having a sort of an overlay that represented how much of that actually is salary would be, I think, a really good development of that unit economics model that you've got there, because if you're working as a cooperative or a CIC, there are issues around profit redistribution. So one of the best ways of realizing the value of the enterprise is creating employment, and good waged employment, real living wage, accredited ideally. And it's just difficult to kind of see how, based on those figures, because it's great driving efficiency. I mean, I'll be honest, the idea of one person packing all the boxes is my idea of like hell. Because for so many reasons. I mean, you named a few of them, but we want to create the right kind of jobs that are fair paid, and obviously see a proportion of all of those activities contributing to a meaningful employment.
I can give you a bit more of a breakdown. I can say with packing, it works out somewhere around 8, like of that 10%, 80 to 90% is labour. And the rest is packaging. And it'll all depend on how much you reuse your boxes.
It will do.
So it's most of it is labour. In terms of transport, obviously that's more fuel and vehicle maintenance and things like that. So you're probably looking at, it's probably 60% labour, 60 to 65% labour, 35%, cost of running the vehicles. With the overheads, that's not labour at all. Marketing can often be a labour component. There's someone's got to get in there and do all the work and stuff, but there's also spend, advertising spend or whatever it is, content development. If you're outsourcing that, admin, that's labour. Software, that's not. And then of course profit really is the thing that you can then spread around to make sure you're achieving living wage and things like that. If profit itself isn't an imperative to that operation.
Are there any questions from anyone on Zoom at this point?
There's a few from Laura. How do the organisations manage the resource required to work meaningfully long term? How do the organisations manage the resource required to work meaningfully long term with complex local communities when it can take a lot of resource aside from the actual growing? And how do they manage to balance the finances with selling the produce versus the resources taken? It's quite long.
So resource. I look at that from a sort of a month-to-month management process. If you are keeping tabs on what is going out and what is coming in, and you're recognizing where you're overspending, and not from a point of view of where you're overspending in that. There are going to be different resource allocations throughout the seasons and throughout the year. You're not going to be able to say, right, it has to be this every single month. But ultimately, being able to manage your resources over time, it's a matter of just incrementally, constantly tweaking as you go, and just ensuring that, okay, if we made a loss last month, we've got to do things to make sure that we're going to cover that loss in this coming month. Otherwise, we're going to 2 months of losses is going to be harder to recover from. So it's a constant management of just keeping you not too far away from that space where you've got the air to breathe. That's my approach to it, is just stay close to the numbers. And there's other things that I've noticed as well. Like we had times when we were running really close, in times when we were running at losses for months and months on end. And we kind of got into emergency state. Right? It's like, well, we can't last another month. This is it for us. And that's where you start to dig deep and you start to think, well, what else can we do? What is going to keep us alive? And that's where you discover things like right, we're going to have to increase the size of the boxes. We're going to increase each, the large boxes, instead of having a budget of £10 of a food budget of £10, we're going to have a food budget of like a purchasing budget of £12. Here we go. Is it a touch screen?
Try the remote, Tony. I want the remote.
There we go. Colin,
Yeah,
you got it. Nice. Yeah, like one of the things we did was we made the boxes bigger. So we didn't put the price, well, we put the price up, but they got more for their food, for their money. So instead of the large box being £20, the large box is now £25, but you're getting £25 worth of food instead of £20. But that effectively put the revenue up by 20%, right? And that meant that everyone was getting a bit more food, but usually the reason we need to put the box price up is because over the years prices been creeping up, and so they were getting less and less and less, and then we adjusted it, and that tended to work. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask the question of Suzy. Can I?
Yeah, and I think there was a first half to that other question on Zoom as well, but we can do that after.
No, you do it.
And I think the first half of that question was how you balance meeting the needs of the community with growing needs, or maybe I misheard.
Yeah, how do the organisations manage the resource required to work meaningfully long-term with complex local communities when it can take a lot of resources aside from it to grow? So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that particularly thinking about cost of living and making food accessible is kind of what we've been talking about with some of our CSAs. I mean, again, I think firstly, you have to want to work with people. You have to like doing that, or you have to have somebody in your team. It doesn't have to be everybody, but you have to have somebody in your team that's doing that. And that can be somebody that's employed. Often in CSAs, it's actually a volunteer who's just really likes organising events, or being the one that's at the farm gate saying hi when people turn up to collect their share. And that's, so there's a lot of resource in your members already that can encourage more members or sort of wider reach. In terms of, during COVID, a lot of CSAs gave away surplus to food banks. There's a whole load of issues around, free food not being the answer, around food banks not wanting fresh food, around people not having the resource or knowledge to cook with fresh food. Now, increasingly, people not wanting to prepare fresh food because it's more expensive because of rising energy prices. So there's a whole load of different things that makes that complicated. We've looked at, there are various different models people have tried. A couple of our CSAs, Soul Farm, which is an OOOBY farm, and Tom Nahar up in Scotland are doing a sliding scale. So they ask people to self-identify with high, middle, low, or no income. And then low income is their cost price box, I think, and then middle and high both have an add-on, and that then funds the no income boxes. There's a Dutch CSA that's done a wage solidarity model, which is quite interesting. And I think School Farm and possibly Stroud might start trying, which is where they've worked out so they've added in everything, all their labour across every bit of that pie chart, and then worked out how many hours it takes to produce a share. And then they said it takes us, for ease, an hour to produce one share. Then they've added on the on cost, so all the sort of input costs as a fixed price. So and then they said you pay us the fixed price plus what you earn an hour for a share, because it takes us an hour, so you pay us your hourly wage. What they have sadly and inevitably discovered is that the people earning at the top end don't pay quite their hourly wage, and the people at the bottom end pay more than their hourly wage, which is a bit depressing, but hey, they're making it work. And we've had a lot of resistance from CSA saying, oh, people aren't going to like that. They won't want to do it. They're going to be put off. The sense from people who made the leap into more solidarity stuff is that actually that's not true. But there's a real fear that asking, I don't know whether it's a British thing, asking for money is really hard. So yeah, sort of watching school farm. There's other work like Sustain have got some money to do something called Bridging the Gap, which is, and they're funding the food to see if that makes a difference, which is what I think one of the research paper, there was a scheme in Wales, I think, that did that. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. In fact, I can't remember the name of the CSA, but certainly there is some examples of that. That's right. I mean, while I'm on, maybe I can sort of bring in another, what I think is a really interesting approach, which is to essentially, rather than look at it as a business transaction, to look at it as a project. So we're going to grow these vegetables and we need to raise X amount of money to fund this, and we raise that money from our membership. And I thought that was actually really quite an interesting and quite innovative way. As I say, it moves away from the X amount of pounds for X amount of veg. So this is what we need to feed everybody.
That's where the Dutch one came from, that idea,
right.
Rather than saying you give me money and I give you veg, I'm going to say I'm going to put this labour in, and you know, I want you to put in the money that you get for your labour. And so it's just moving away from it's price. But funding the additional, and I mean, interestingly, when we were talking about, she did a webinar for us earlier this year, and one of the questions from a UK CSA was, how do you value your volunteer time? Like, is that costed in as part of your what it costs per hour? And she said no. And she clarified that the reason she said no was because she felt like she probably put in as much time supporting some of her more needy volunteers as she got from some of her more effective in growing terms volunteers, which, I mean, wouldn't work for everyone as an argument, but I just thought was quite an interesting, because there's definitely, there are most of our CSAs have volunteers who are really helpful and some who are really helped, and a lot of them see that as fine. That's part of supporting a local community and bringing people together. But yeah, so I think it's to the person on Zoom, it's not an easy one to work out how you manage that, and it's a lot. I mean, growing food is a lot, and then I'm doing other stuff on top is pretty huge. So yeah, Christopher, you had a question.
Yeah, you sort of actually started answering, because I was sort of wondering that what we've had from OOOBY is very much, we grow veg, we sell it, we just happen to sell it in boxes to a preordained order. You're doing something that's completely different. And I think actually been talking a bit more about that over the last few minutes, but the question was really, how sort of alien is that unit economics and breaks down in this way to a CSA? How much do you need to concern yourself with that sort of thing? And I think from what you just said, you don't actually, or in some ways you pump up a lot of other aspects, which a box scheme, even if it's a sort of an OOOBY type model, doesn't have to do. You're obliged to do in your charter. You're set up in a very different way. Just a bit more on that, really.
So I think, I mean, UK CSA is massively diverse. So some of our most box scheme like CSAs, I mean, a lot of our CSAs are on OOOBY. Not a lot, but yeah, a fair few. There's a map on the next slide and quite a few. So there are CSAs, I mean, yeah, CSA in the UK is really diverse, and we're trying to move. So we sort of would typically have community-led CSAs started by a group in a community who were saying there's no access to decent food. Let's form some kind of legal entity, find some land, usually employ growers or farmers and produce food. And often the management or the admin, so most of the overhead stuff would be done voluntarily by the board in that model. Not always. So Canal Side, Gareth, they employ him to do finance, and they also have an admin worker who does school visits and all the membership admin and all the kind of back office stuff 2 days a week, and then they have a team of growers. And then at the other end, you've got the sort of producer-led CSAs, which is typically a couple who've done, met doing grower training, decided they want to earn a living from growing food, found some land, and then looked for their membership from whatever community they've ended up in. I guess we're moving away from it, because in the end, a lot of them end up looking quite similar, because the producer-led ones develop a real community, and the community-led ones develop a really strong growing team. So it kind of, they meld, and there's, I mean, a lot of CSA self-defined in our survey this year as producer community partnership, which was quite interesting. We didn't expect as many as did to kind of self-define as that. I think you go into CSA from an ethical, I mean, I think the one thing that does hold CSAs together is an ethically led sort of, or values led reason for doing it, which I don't think is necessarily true of all what veg box schemes, and a belief in, yeah, in a sustainable food system and locally produced food, because again, a lot of box schemes will buy in, a lot of box schemes will buy in from abroad. None of our CSAs buy in from abroad. They will buy, some of them buy in, but they buy in because they're not equipped to do field scale, or they buy in over Hungry Gap. But they do a lot of thinking, like Camel, I know Charlotte's on listening, and they had a really big discussion in their CSA about whether they were going to buy in local in Cornwall. So everything is produced in Cornwall, but there was no organic potato producer in Cornwall, or do they buy in from outside Cornwall, but then they get organic potatoes. So these kind of, those discussions around the ethics of what you're doing, I think really underpin CSA. I don't know if that's...
No, that's really important, but actually having that discussion, it almost doesn't matter which answer they came up with, because either answer is valid for different reasons. But having the discussion enabled thoughts to happen amongst the whole group of people, which has a big impact. And I'm wondering whether, I mean, so CSAs are selling through OOOBY, but OOOBY is essentially a marketing platform, if you like. And I don't want to be provocative. I'm just wondering how much you are good bedfellows. Actually, you're talking about very different things. Does that, I mean, I'm not saying that matters. It's just, it's a reflection. It seems like you're shoehorned onto one table, and yet you're actually really quite separate in a way in your approach, or not?
I think it's an ongoing discussion, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's... Please go.
I don't mind picking up. I feel like you're being put on the spot.
I
mean, it's a good question.
No, it's a good question.
Yeah.
And it's, yeah.
So just to try and pick that apart objectively, so you've got to have a route to market, and increasingly, particularly with COVID, digital platforms were a really important part of enabling that. Now, at Regather, I don't know where we sit in the sort of CSA network kind of definition, the spectrum, but I know we set up a community and we feed people and we sustain that through jobs and growing and so on. But we have to have a digital platform, and we've been with Boxmaster for a number of years, and that is coming to an end, and we're going to have to find an alternative. And obviously, you know, in the end, you need a platform, you need a digital platform, and they're not easy things to kind of, you know, find, and they're not easy things to manage, and there are certain characteristics of different platforms, you know, digital platforms that have knock-on effects, you know, depending on how they're set up. And we can obviously talk from experience as to how we've gone from a spreadsheet-based system when we were dealing with like 20, 50 customers. Then we were on WordPress using WooCommerce just off the shelf. Version 3 was WordPress with some additional programming. Version 4 was Boxmaster. Version 5, you know, is TBC, you know, because there's a number of issues that we've got to contend with. But yeah, every box scheme or CSA wanting to be able to make themselves available online without incurring massive additional overheads, or maybe making themselves entirely difficult to find, everyone needs an OOOBY basically, or needs a Boxmaster, or needs something. You know, and there's a proliferation of digital platforms. The important questions for us and organisations like us increasingly is actually, you know, what's under the bonnet, who owns them, how are they financed, what are the kind of you know, levers that can be pulled to enable that. And I feel like that's the shared area potentially, you know, which is why this is a session that I'm sat in on, you know, as opposed to another one, you know, really.
Right.
That's going to be my question as well.
Great.
Do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, Thank you for raising it, because I think it is an area of like potential confusion, and an area where it could, like the very fact that you said is are they the right bedfellows? Yeah. It's hard to sort of distinguish what the motives are behind, digital platforms. Like if you think of Ocado or you think of Amazon, it's pretty easy to say, right, that is a profit motive. It's very clear. It's a go out, winner takes all approach to owning a market, dominating a market. And then that can then be just spread across, well, Amazon is a digital market. Amazon is like this, therefore all digital markets are like this. So it's, where we've come from it is to say that the problem with the food system in general is that it is too centralized. It is too dominated by too few players. It's too concentrated. And what needs to happen is there needs to be, within the digital landscape, there needs to be the ability for independent organizations, whether they be a farm, an independent farm, or whether they be a community organization, to be able to have the same capacity to operate within this new, marketplace, the internet, as the big players. They need to be able to foot it in that marketplace. Otherwise, they're going to be completely pushed to the edges, or they're going to be kept at the edges. So our whole philosophy has been around, how do we, number one, build a toolkit like an online digital platform that can compete, where the customers can go onto their phone or go onto their computer and they feel like the experience is one where it contends with what they're used to having, when they go shopping. Because if we can't deliver that, then it's always going to be, those independent businesses are always going to be at the edge of the market. And the second thing is, how do we make sure that platform doesn't end up becoming like a dominant, centrally owned asset that then is used to exploit all the users of the platform? And so on that front, and from the beginning, when we set OOOBY up in 2008, this has always been the pledge and what we've enacted on, and that is that it needs to be a distributed ownership model, right? Where the platform itself, where the technology is owned and governed on a distributed type of ownership model. So in New Zealand, when we set it up, we basically had it where we moved 90% of the company into a charitable trust. So it was owned and controlled by a charitable trust. And the remaining 10% was shared among the team that established and built the platform. And then we did a crowdfunding round through our customers and our growers, and which meant that in total, 85% ended up being owned by the charity and 15% was user owned. And that's how we did it from 2015. And now now arriving here in the UK, there's a new OOOBY UK has been established, and the IP from New Zealand it hasn't yet been transferred to OOOBY UK, but the IP being transferred into the UK entity is the arrangement and the predetermined, like the pledge we've made with people who have recently invested in OOOBY, which are foundations, impact foundations like Be the Earth Foundation, A-Team Foundation, where they've effectively given us a loan, which has been on very good terms, but it's a loan that can convert to equity at some point. But that allows, part of the pledge was that they will only do that if we implement a user ownership model, right? Where it's the farmers, it's potentially the customers of the farmers, and it's the team that are building and growing the platform that are the ones that ultimately own, and the ownership is distributed across that user base. So it's both. We're coming at it from both angles. I think we're probably perceived in the market as being primarily about a digital marketing platform, because our our focus is about effectiveness in the market and making sure that you can get customers, you can keep customers on, that customers feel like they've, that they're getting the service that they need. But, at the heart of it, it's about how do we basically allow for smaller independent food producers to reclaim market share and to not be exploited. And that's where our software is an open source software, but it's an open ownership platform, and that's the key to it. So that's how we're approaching it, and it's an evolving thing. We've got to do it in a clever way so that we don't end up getting caught into a situation where it becomes very heavily bureaucratic, and then we end up slowing down to the point where the rest of the market takes off ahead. And we can't really keep this as a sharp and lean platform, but we got, that's part of the job, is to figure that out.
I was just, I guess sort of, is it all right with a microphone on the table?
You need to be online, people.
You've got microphones on your table. Yeah.
You can turn that one around. It's probably picks up from, I'm not sure.
All right, I'll do that. I think it's a really interesting question. I think within the network, we're seeing an increasing number of CSAs kind of talking about degrowth and talking about decoupling from the kind of very, very dominant capitalist model of needing to make profit. And it's really hard. I mean, there's so many, it's actually quite difficult to find spaces where that is an accepted thing to do. I think even within this kind of group of people, it's surprisingly hard. We had a discussion in the board of the network brought up by the finance manager of a CSA about whether being not-for-profit should be included within the charter, and the board decided that it shouldn't be. A lot of our CSAs are for-profit technically. I wonder whether that will change. At the same time as the sort of, I think, increased awareness for that in sort of climate terms, there's also an increasing number of larger farms looking at CSA, partly, I think, pushed by ELMS if it actually happens, and the kind of need to have more public goods on their farms, but also increased awareness of the need for sustainable food systems. So it's not all, I'm not saying it's all bad or just because of ELMS, but and they're operating very much within a profit system. So it's kind of, it's really interesting, really tricky. I think on the software question, some of our CSAs, a lot of our CSAs just want a software solution to all the back office admin and 15 different Excel sheets, which is, as you know, when you get to about 100, 150 people, is confusing and difficult. And if there was an easy solution, that's what they're looking for, because actually access to market for most of our current CSAs isn't really an issue, because people come to the CSA and get their food. I think if we're going to see CSA expand into cities, we will need either some sort of cooperative form of working together, or probably that combined with some decent software that's going to allow us to do that. So I think there's definitely a place for the right software. I was really pleased to find out OOOBY was working with Open Food Network, because Open Food Network is open source. It's also quite clunky and doesn't work brilliantly for CSAs at the moment, because it's not built on, again, I mean, it's really the same issue, that it's built to sell to people that aren't there, whereas a CSA doesn't need that. But I guess behind all of that is this stuff about economics. So what your question about this is useful for CSAs. A lot of CSAs don't have a clue where they're losing money or making money, which is why we're doing the economic work. What we're trying to do is say, this isn't the be all, and there's different bits that you need to think about. And actually your social capital is as important as your financial capital, but you can't run your social capital and forget about the economics, because you're going to go under. And we need the CSAs not to go under. We need them to be operating not only in a way that supports people as growers and farmers now, but also in a way that allows them to retire. And I mean, I think that's the other thing, is working pensions, decent pensions and places to live into the system, so that, increasingly growers can't afford to even rent where they're growing, let alone get a mortgage. So I think this is really important, but it's understanding, it's coming back to understanding it as earning a living, not making shed loads of money.
Yeah.
I mean, which is really tricky in our current context, because that's not what the dominant worldview is. Sorry, it was a little bit of a rant there. There's Tony's got his hand as well.
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to pick up on Chris's question really, and talk about that idea, perhaps not specifically in a CSA context. I'm involved in a project, as is Pete, which is really about helping digital platforms share information with each other. It's called the Food Collaboration, the Food Data Collaboration Project, and I won't go into it now. But essentially, we're at a really interesting stage where we have to really start becoming quite clear about the type of platforms that we want to be involved in this project. And getting the boundaries right is absolutely crucial, because if you set them too narrow, we will forever only be feeding 2 or 3 million people through short supply chain systems. If you set them too wide, we get Amazon. So we are needing to find that sweet spot where we can really set the boundaries, and those boundaries are around the objectives of the project, which are agroecological food, fair access for and fair prices for consumers, fair prices for farmers. So yeah, we're having to turn those project objectives into some quite clear boundaries, which determines who we let in and who we don't. And that's an interesting and exciting process.
I think it's important to come at this from a perspective as profit isn't a dirty word. If whether for a non-CSA like my farm or for a CSA, I think profit for CSA is a really positive thing, because why wouldn't a community want to support a farmer to make a profit, giving them a decent living? And I mean, we're not talking huge numbers. Like if you look at, I don't know what the average box numbers for CSA is, but maybe 100. You're saying 150 tends to be the big end. Okay, so if you looked at 80, then I'd imagine the average revenue is probably coming in at about £60,000. 10% profit on the distribution side of that is £6,000. I mean, you can look at spending 100 grand starting a farm from bare field and still only be halfway there when it comes to, you know, if it's a bare field and you don't even have a packing shed, no water, no electricity, you're scratching the surface with £100,000. Like even spending it wisely. If some farms try and work on using labour to get away from spending money on infrastructure, which I'm not sure is a sensible long-term model, but it's done out of necessity from not having the initial funding in order to put decent infrastructure in. But you will have profit in the 50% as well that's on the screen. But again, profit's not a dirty word. And even if you had another 15-20% on that, like, wow, like we're talking 20 grand, which the farmer's probably putting in 60-80 hours. I wouldn't be surprised a week, especially at the beginning. So like, who's gonna sort of be annoyed that they're maybe making 20-30,000 pounds a year on the back of that? I think the profit is, because we're looking at this like organic and agroecological and sustainable, and like profit is not a dirty word, even though like it's kind of, we're using sort of Amazon and that their kind of profit, you know, it might be more than like acceptable, but like our kind of profit is not a bad thing.
I just wanted to clarify the profit for us would be post paying back what you'd put up in capital to get the farm started, and post a decent salary including pension. So it would be, so you wouldn't be paying yourself a decent, I mean, obviously in an ideal world, but and it's not, it's about what happens to the profit more than, I mean, I think that's more of the question. Yeah, I totally agree. Farms need to think about profit, but it's what you do with the profit.
Yeah, and also I imagine if you were to take out, especially the farms that are younger than sort of 15-20 years, like I'd be surprised how much, if there's a decent level of profit after paying a living wage for every hour that labour is put into that farm, like everybody works there, paying all the loans and infrastructure back, and not charging an extortionate amount of money for the products, which I don't think like anyone really is doing. But yeah, I imagine the profit is quite small for CSAs and most farms. I mean, you can find our profit on company's house, and it's non-existent because there's that much capital input. I think
it's often, I think, a good way of looking at profit is your survivability. Like if you don't have profit, then you've probably got losses. It's hard to stay right on that line. And so you're either making a profit or you're making a loss typically. And so profit is often survivability because it's the buffer that allows for that next season, which is going to be a loss. So in my mind, it's regardless of whether it's a not-for-profit or a for-profit organization, it's not the point. The point is you want to make sure that your operation is profitable so that it can sustain itself over time and that it can also reinvest that in whichever way is most sensible.
If I can, so for us, it's about ownership and governance.
Right.
Yeah, because you're absolutely right. And profitability is essential for a sustainable business. But what determines what happens to the profit, or what determines if the business goes under, what happens to the business, or if it's incredibly successful, someone comes along and says, "Oh, I'd love to buy you." What kind of protections, what kind of mechanisms are there to ensure that what happens next in any one of those scenarios is in the best interest of that community?
Yeah.
So questions of ownership and governance are central to then determining the conditions in which everything else happens. So it's questions around governing documents, or memorandums, articles, association, whatever that might be, the legal structure of these. I think that's when it comes to digital platforms, whether they're Amazon, Ocado, or OOOOBY, or Boxmaster, or new entrants like Growing Good, or whoever, they're there with a particular structure, and you can go on Company's House and you can see what it is. Open Food Network as well. There's such a diversity of structures, and particularly when data is involved, you've got proprietary ownership, coming into play as well, and issues of data access, data protection, and if we look at the supermarket model and the dominant players in this sector, their ownership over proprietary data gives them the significant competitive advantage. And that, whether it's knowing who the customer is, or what they buy, or how much they paid for something, or which offers they went for, what route they took around the store, if you're carrying a mobile phone that's got the right app on it, etc., etc. I mean, that data is what's driving all of these. So when we're talking about agroecological food systems and food system transformation, to do that without data that's a suicide mission, basically. So these are really fundamental questions, and I think for any organisation moving into this kind of asking questions about which digital platform, or do I grow or do I decouple and go into degrowth? It's really challenging, to understand actually what the best decisions are, and accessing the right information, to be able to make an informed decision. It's incredibly challenging. Certainly been our experience at Regather.
I think it'd be interesting also to start using profit to talk about social and environmental profit. I mean, it's a term so tied to a certain thing, although it's not. I mean, I agree with you, but I also think it has a lot of connotations, and it's often seen as dirty or wrong. I mean, and that's in a way one of the problems for some CSAs is that they don't want to look at finance because it's like, oh no, that's not what I'm doing it for. But you've got to think about money
Well, I think you made,
But you, yeah.
yeah, to make the living, you've said it already. In this country, buying a house is easily the most sort of capitalist action one can do. It puts us in the most amount of debt, in just some sort of day-to-day living, and then having a job, and paying tax into the system. That's also a really important, like, societal function. People have places to live, jobs to work. So much of that's unattainable to so many people on the right terms, particularly owning a house. But if we don't create an economy within the agroecological food system that allows people access to those, I wouldn't call them entitlements, but things, rights, right to a house, right to a job, right to food. If we don't do it with an economy that is viable, what are we doing?
I think just anecdotally, I was at another conference a couple of weeks ago, and somebody from Unicorn Grocery in Manchester was talking. I mean, they're amazing on it with their finances. And somebody asked, sort of prefaced what they were going to say with talking to them with, "You're not a business, so you won't." And I was just like, wow, that's really interesting, because they're an incredibly high functioning cooperative business, but because they're a co-op, they weren't perceived as a business, which I thought was.
That's the neoliberal capitalist culture that we exist in, writ large.
Just to clarify, I guess I was coming from the perspective of believing that CSAs should be able to make a profit, and I think the view as a profit is not a profit for profit's sake, but more after the living wage, but before pensions. Being able to afford eventually to buy the land that you're working on, and that you're not just sort of renting for 40, 50 years, and then when you can no longer work the land, having to leave because you've got nothing for it. You've got no, it's not sustainable if you can't save up. And also because I imagine there are CSAs that struggle in the downtimes if they haven't, and any business, that to be able to save and like save it into a bank account for those slower years. I was coming from the perspective of more that I think it's good for CSAs, and because I know, and I'm in alliance with a couple of CSAs, and I, like, as anyone in the room really knows, they're not doing it for money. They're doing it because they want that kind of lifestyle. They want to grow good food, and they want the community to have access to good food.
I think it's largely about the ability to be independent, right? That's the key in my mind, is when you're dependent, you don't have your own autonomy. You don't have your own agency. You're forced to play by whoever you're dependent on's rules. The ability for you, depending on what the nature of the business is, but if we're talking about a farm, the ability for you as someone who's going to take a risk to get some land, or take a risk to take on some land that maybe your family, from your family or whatever, and build up the infrastructure and the work that needs to be done in order for you to be able to be independent, is part of what's going to make for a very resilient food system. Now, there's a point where you go too far. There's a point where profitability takes you beyond just having independence and the ability to stay alive in bad storms. But there's a sweet spot where you don't want to be too dependent, where you kind of just have to work within the means of whatever you can cobble together, or whatever grant funding, whatever you can get. That's the key. And if a CSA is able to operate in a manner where they've got all their books working, and look, everyone's getting paid a living wage, or everyone's getting paid commensurate with the amount of effort they're putting in, and we are independent. We're not relying on having to get a grant funding to come in to support this. We're not relying. We can get grant funding because that'll help us to maybe grow something, put another polytunnel and so forth. But in my mind, the key is gain independence as an entity, whether you're a community entity, whether you're a personal, you and your partner entity, whatever. But that's the key to a resilient, or one of the keys to a resilient food system, is that as many of us as possible are independent. We might be able to.
I don't know, is
Yeah,
anyone
it's
time
3:30.
It's 3:30.
But it'll say you can carry on, but we will start the next session at 4.
Oh, okay, it's not till 4.
Well, yeah, I mean, I get.
Just to follow on from what you're saying there, it's very interesting. I mean, we are interested in creating dependencies, because that's a more resilient and a more integrated model. So if you talk about vertical integration of short supply chains, you're actually trying to build a situation where businesses can work with one another, and so we're building dependencies as opposed to trying to establish independencies. And so it's fundamentally different in that respect. I mean, it's the sort of conversation you'd have in the pub over a beer. But there is a certain amount of recognizing dependencies as being a source of solidarity, of relationships that are not only resilient but reliant on more than just one person. And I keep going back to this idea of just one person packing 300 boxes. I mean, so in essence, the alternative to that would be to try and create as many jobs as economically viable out of any process that the business needs to fulfill, and employing as many people as possible as a result. And that is, there's a dependency there, because the business is there to create a living for those employees. So I would just be, I'd talk about that in a different sort of way. Personally, the notion of an entire food system of independent operators, it is essentially the preconditions for a more of a sort of free market situation where the things are much more interchangeable, and allow for a degree of flexibility that goes well beyond actually what we're trying to create here, which is much more of a kind of steady state, far less inequality, and a situation where we're not just all about growth, but we're also about managed degrowth, because that's actually what we've got to do, to get to net zero. To remove the level of externalities that exist in our food system. We can't just carry on doing what we're doing currently. It's got to fundamentally change. There's got to really look at actually what that looks like on the ground, and that's the sort of decoupling, degrowth model. And in the process of doing that, we're just going to create much greater levels of dependency in between different actors, rather than a notion of establishing independence, because that is essentially that is the precondition for the free market. Fundamentally unfettered, deregulation, no state intervention, everything there, open, transparent, and independent. Well, which I will always do in a debate. So
it's interesting. Okay, it's an interesting, and I take it on board. I guess the distinction there is, what are you dependent on? Like if I as a farm, let's say I'm a farmer, and I am dependent on, I'm not making, my business isn't covering its own costs. It's not covering its own, its own costs. So it's making a loss. Then I am becoming dependent on whoever it is that is going to fill my cup to the top, right? In a lot of cases, that comes down to having to hand my hat out to, the government, having to hand my hat out to other places where that dependency comes with strings attached. And that dependency is not necessarily a healthy dependency. Now, we're all dependent on each other. We're all interdependent. Like you can't have a business that's not depending on its customers, not depending on, you know, its inputs. There is natural dependency that always exists. But I think that one of the challenges that we are facing is that we are forced into situations that make us more vulnerable to exploitation because we don't have the ability to stand on our own 2 feet. So yeah, like if I think about all the farmers out there that are in a really tough situation and you know, at the point of you know, the whole suicide rates and so forth, it's often in the cases because they don't have the autonomy, they don't have the ability to be able to play in the market in a manner that this actually keeps their head above water. They're constantly at the effect of the traders who are buying off them saying, this is all I'm going to give you for it, and if you don't take that price, then you get nothing, and I'm not going to give you all of it now, I'm going to give you a bit of it now and a bit of it later, and then just enough for you to sell your next batch, your next crop, and it's like these. So there's this, it's a very big challenge.
But isn't that the whole point? I mean, in a way, we're back to the title, which is that if you have a short supply chain local system, you can be more resilient and you're more connected. You are dependent, but you're dependent on your small community, right, which is a really strong dependence, but you're not dependent on external factors that fluctuate because of markets and people who have nothing to do with food or farming.
If we look at the CSA as the kind of an example of an idealized, you know, future that we want much more of, and the problem is working out ways of making more of that happen everywhere. You know, let's just say we're all in agreement with that just by virtue of sitting in this room. You know, but the question then is you know, talking about dependencies and interdependencies is, you know, is the role of the farmer, and I think there's a fundamental disconnect with our food system, you know, between those that eat the food and those that produce the food. And the CSA is an example of the reconnection taking place, you know, on a fundamental level, you know, both physically, but also, you know, in culturally, socially, environmentally, you know, those are all the outcomes, and that accumulation of you know, common wealth that comes out of that process. And you know, I'm not going to deny everything that you've just outlined as being the reality for the industrialized food system, because that is the reality, and you know, I'd be daft to pretend that wasn't the case. The question is what do we do about that? You know, and we've got to talk about reconnecting people with their food, because then the role of the farmer becomes more valued, and you know, the free market over a period of time, you know, and profit motivated business, you know, purely profit motivated business, the commodification of the food system, you know, is what underpins the set of conditions that allows farmers to be disconnected, to be just interchangeable parts of a global food system, you know, and they've no longer become people, you know, they are just, you know, human machines in a food production system, and it's very dystopian, and you know, it gets all a bit dark, but you know, that's actually, there's a set of preconditions that creates the possibility of that reality. Yeah, and those are the things that we've got to like change back. You know, and the CSA is that happening.
I think we should, I can see Tony going,
I need to go to the next session. So, if you want to cut the off, you've got 20 minutes.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thanks, Gareth. I do appreciate the point. I'd love to carry on that conversation.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks, Suzy. See you. An hour and a half, no problem. We didn't even get through all our slides.
Yeah, this is actually how